Let's move on then into the end of the Middle Ages. Now we're moving into, again, the 14th and 15th century. And as we move into the 14th and 15th century, we'll see more and more changes beginning to happen in society and how that affects Christianity as well, because of how tied Christianity is to Western culture, especially by this time. There are quite a few things that are going on in society that will have some very important consequences with the practice of Christianity. First is the development of a monetary economy. Now, what we're talking about with a monetary economy are things like credit. If we're seeing increases in trade, increases in the ability to manufacture. And because of this burgeoning monetary economy, you have the development of a middle class. Right? They're not the people that are involved in this are not the aristocrats. Right? They're not the nobles, the lords. They're not the very poor people. They're people that are in the middle there. Right? They're the people that are involved in trade and production, in banking. But as the middle class develops, they start to question some of the taxes that they have to pay. They start to question who should have the real power and authority in society. And that's not just about the struggle with the aristocrats and the lords, it's also about religious authority as well. All right? And so, there's this questioning of authority that goes on. And also, a lot of the middle class in many of these places wanted to have a strong centralized government instead of these nobles ruling specific areas. And so we'll see that bringing changes as well. A second thing changing in society at this time is the development of nationalism. Many of the modern nation states we think of in Europe especially are developing at this time, which is breeding within the consciousness of people, not just a local identity, right? You live in this town. Now you start to think of a national identity. We're French, those kind of things, those kind of ideas. And usually this is also breeding a commonality amongst us against other nations. As these nations develop, each of them has a different relationship with the papacy. And some of them are very close in following the papacy. Others are questioning the Pope's authority. A third condition changing at this time is an increase in trade routes. Trade routes to the Baltics, trade routes to China. All of this, of course, bringing in other types of influences, people connecting with other groups, and bringing not only goods back to Europe and places like that, but also bringing some ideas and philosophies, texts, other things like that. At the same time, of course, Christianity going to these places, and we'll talk about that, some of the mission work done at this time. And so a lot of growth taking place, a lot of changes taking place. But on the other hand, in this time period, another big element of this development are these moments of crisis. Beginning in the 14th century, there were several moments of economic and social disruption and, of course, disease. In the early 1300s, there were several times where there were poor harvests and famine, social unrest, dissatisfaction with the nobles, and then moments of the bubonic plague. And so the bubonic plague, carried by rats, comes to the west from the east, and particularly coming from the Black Sea, and most people have no immunity to it. And the medical knowledge about it is very lacking in these places. It was called the Black Death because these black blisters would form on people. And the symptoms would appear very quickly. Loss of balance, fever, swollen lymph nodes, dementia. Many people died within 5 days of their exposure to the Black Plague. From 1347 to 1350, Europe lost 1/4 of its population. with some communities losing over a third. And throughout the 14th century, there were outbreaks of this every 10 to 12 years, which, of course, disrupts the economics, it disrupts the politics, but it disrupts religion as well. And so, even though we think, okay, well, this is just it's an issue of illness and disease, well, it had some important consequences on religious life as well. One aspect of the Black Plague that had an effect on religion is the large numbers of clergy that died from the Black Plague. Sometimes as much as half the clergy population in some places died. A second consequence was the revival of Joachim Fiore's views, right? The end is coming. Right? And so, this is a sign of the end times. Others looked at the Black Death as an expression of God's wrath and said that it had come because of the corruption of the church, because there was a lack of unity among people, the failure of the Crusades. All of these were pointed to by people to say, this is why this is happening to us, because God is dissatisfied. On the other hand, while some people viewed it as God's wrath, it gave other people a place to begin to doubt God's existence or God's goodness. Right? If God truly was a loving God, why would He allow this to happen? Right? And so you have an increased skepticism that begins to take place among some people. Instead of doubt, some people turn to superstition to ward off the Black Death. A variety of magical potions, curses, charms, all of which are believed at various times to try and ward off the Black Death. And so people turning to non-Christian forms of religious practice. People went on pilgrimages. Right? Particularly to the Holy Land, but to other holy places, believing that somehow that would earn them religious merit by which they could escape the Black Death, be protected from the illness. The last of the religious consequences I want to talk about are the number of people that blamed the Jews for the Black Death. Apparently, the Jews did not experience the Black Death to the same measure as the Christian population in Europe. It's unclear why this took place. Some people have offered a variety of explanations. Some seem fairly reasonable. Some suggest that Jews had more cats. Right? So cats ate the rats before they beat people. And that's why they had less Black Death in the Jewish community. Maybe it's due to better sanitation practices that Jews had because they were following the law. Right? And so by following the law, they had better sanitation, and so smaller rat population, not as many people did. But it's unclear exactly why. But nobody at that time is thinking these reasons are why the Jews are escaping the Black Death. Nobody's saying, maybe it's because they have more cats. They're not because they don't understand it. It's the rats, it's actually the fleas on the rats, but there's this lack of medical knowledge. And so Jews were often accused of bringing the Black Death on the Christian population. And so people would claim they had poisoned the wells of Christians. And that's what was happening, is they were drinking this poisoned water and people were dying. And so this assumption that Jews were somehow responsible for this. Jews would be tortured, and some Jews would actually confess to similar crimes because of the torture. Thousands of Jews were killed in Europe as part of this blaming them for the Black Plague. Some of it was fear, certainly, but there's just a lot of uncertainty about all of this. And even when several popes through this time would issue proclamations that Jews were not responsible, the mobs didn't listen and continued to blame Jews for the Black Death. In the midst of all this time period as well, there are other political things going on, like the 100 Years' War, which lasted from around 1337 to some date at 1453, some date at 1475. It has to do with the full cessation of hostilities. If you're doing your math, neither one of those dates is 100 years. It's actually more than 100 years, but it just doesn't sound good to say, well, let's talk about the more than 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War was essentially a conflict between England and France that eventually drew in some other nations as well. Largely it's about this piece of land in France that was under control of England. Right? So it's in France, but the English have control of it. So there's that aspect. And the other side, the Scots and the Welsh are trying to exert independence from England, and the French are supporting them. All right? And so there's this kind of back and forth between France and England. And also there's claims to the French throne in all of this. All right? So the King of England tries to take the French throne. And it involves several different invasions of France. There's fighting in all sorts of places, leading to breaking of treaty. The French eventually have a civil war. But in the midst of all this, the religious part, right? How does this have anything to do with Christianity? Well, I want to bring up the rather interesting experiences of Joan of Arc. Around the age of 12 or 13, Joan claimed that she was having visions and voices telling her to lead armed forces, that she should be in the army and that she should be in charge. And eventually she does lead French forces when she turns 18 and helps put the rightful French ruler back on his throne, Charles VII. And Charles has some trust in Joan. Eventually, Joan convinces Charles VII to attack Paris, which was under English control. She is wounded by a crossbow and is eventually captured by the English. She is put on trial for a couple of things. She's put on trial for dressing like a man, for communicating with angels, and for having visions. Eventually she signs a statement that is recanting of all of that. But she's illiterate, and she only makes a cross as a symbol of her, this is how I'm signing it. But some believe that she doesn't really understand what she's signing. Eventually the voices return, and so she recants her recanting. And kind of goes back to saying that she's receiving voices and visions from God. Eventually, she is burned at the stake by the English. For a couple of years after her death, two of her brothers attempt to pass off an impostor as their sister, and saying that she's still alive and this is her. And she would receive lavish gifts on her behalf, but the impostor eventually admits to Charles VII that this was all false. Eventually, she would be retried. She's dead. She's going to be retried. And in the retrial, she's exonerated. Right? She's declared innocent. And will eventually be declared a saint. Will be canonized as a saint of the church. Not because of her military work, but because of her intolerance of heresy. She was active in trying to suppress heresy as well. With the economic, political, social instability going on, people often blame the church. And so even though we don't see like a clear religious issue going on between France and England, all of this unrest caused people to lash out at the rulers, but then also the church, and would attack church institutions, church lands. During times of disease, some priests would flee. They would just kind of abandon their post and try to find stable places in disease. Other priests stood up to serve and attempt to relieve the suffering of people in parish. So the church is involved in all of this in very many important ways. In the East, however, things are going down for the Byzantine Empire. From the early 1300s, the Byzantine Empire was beginning to break apart. If you remember when we were talking earlier, there was a group of Muslims known as the Turks that were gradually moving into the Eastern Empire, taking control of a variety of cities and cutting east from west. The Black Death, blockades on Constantinople, makes it more and more unstable. The East tries to make some attempts at reconciliation with the West in order to gain help from the Western Empire, or the Western Church, Western Europe, to try and stop the spread of Islam that is gradually cutting its way into the Byzantine Empire. In 1438, a council of reunion occurred between the Byzantine Emperor, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Pope. So the three of these leaders meet together, and that results in the Byzantine Emperor and the Patriarch agreeing to papal primacy, that the Pope is the head of the Church, and that filioque, the statement that the Spirit proceeds from the Son as well as the Father.
Who are those three?
The Byzantine Emperor, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Pope. So they agree. We'll agree with it. But when they take it back home, the rest of the people in the Byzantine Empire say, no. Right? I mean, we disagree very vehemently with this. And so the patriarchs of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria reject the decision and break off from the Patriarch of Constantinople because they cannot abide this. And so these attempts to unite, to stem the spread of Islam, fail. In 1451, Muhammad II begins planning the last assault on the city. The Byzantine Emperor appealed to the West. The Pope says, the only way we're going to help you is if there's reunification. There is, to some extent, Latin form of the Mass was held in the Hagia Sophia, so the Catholic Mass, but in April 1453, the Muslims lay siege to Constantinople. The city holds out until the end of May, when it is finally conquered. Questions of any of the about any of the political developments in this period?
You said the Byzantine Empire was the Patriarch of who?
Constantinople.
Yeah, 1451.
1438 is when that council has. 1451 is when they're starting to move into Constantinople, falling in 1453. Other questions?
Constantinople fell in
1453. And eventually it'll be renamed Istanbul.
So 1455.
No, it's actually not officially renamed Istanbul until 1928. It's called Istanbul for a while, but the Muslims finally officially referred to it as Istanbul in 1928. Yeah. 9 3/4.